Welcome to Precise Elements, where we investigate the depths of the imagination, of our imagination, word formation, and the psychology of deep psychology of projection. Now, in today's science, we hear the statement: consciousness and life are the hard problems of science. It's like a refrain that echoes through the whole of our physics and artificial intelligence and all the high notions that we have today. I like to listen to the podcast because for me it's a source of knowledge and learning. Now, living imagination, viewed as world-forming principle, forms the external and internal projection and progression of all the abundance of forms of God who participate within the processes or operation of wholeness of the universe. A participation indeed through the seen and unseen forming processes. In this view on psychological world formation and projection, we embrace a new vision, a vision that does not make of consciousness or life a difficulty, but rather aspects of experience, of our experience, that is necessary for the formation of the primary interactive processes and relations that upholds our flowing external world. Indeed, a participative complexity of formation who participates through the embrace of wholeness in every respect. The unity of our consciousness, our experience may well be an interformation of these fields and these internal processes of wholeness and our own participation. That is to say, of relations of the seen and the unseen. Now, matter unsubscribed by the intellect or mind seem to us to possess neither the ability to form nor of perceiving or to possess any unity by itself. Both mind and matter as it appears to us, the first opposition or difference, seem to be necessary for formation. We'll say more about this as we go on. Now, Heraclitus, famed contemporary of Pythagoras, is often quoted today by the wonderful psychiatrist Dr. McGilchrist. He says, Heraclitus says that they know not that differing agrees with itself. Backflying harmony or resonance, as though of lyre and bow. That is, as a stretched string flies back against to its original position. Tension between opposites is necessary for internal formation. It brings a higher unity of understanding. We say that the whole of our world perspective appears to be a resonant participation and a unity, a flawless participation indeed, flawlessly flowing without seams or break. Moreover, it seems to me that when my awareness interforms with the unseen within, new ideas come to me. The internal subtlety of touching, of this contemplative touching, keeps pace with my own learning and my own knowledge and requires my unremitting attention. Further, this seemed to me an aspect of a greater internal psychological formative process that always are flowing and changing. Indeed, it is most obvious that our world changes all the time, and it changes fast. But we have to do the contemplative work, for this is the interconnection with psychological formation, learning, and the internal formation of touching. But we've been told since Descartes and Galileo that the things that we can't see can't be measured. We have no number, no geometry, and no coordinates that we can apply to these kinds of things. This was 400 years ago. Indeed, the mathematicians today love to say, as it turns out, mathematics is the language of nature, as they say, and the precision of physics and its laws of nature are indisputable. Now, what can we now say about our world if this is the status of what we can discern about our world? Moreover, what can we say about the imagination and our fantasy and projection? For from another perspective, we may say that the stuff we measure with our models, mathematical models, possess neither existence nor being without that which we cannot see. Hidden variables is what some preeminent scientists call these. Tensions, harmonics, governing, forming internal psychological forming processes. These are to be discovered. Imagination is the inner doorway, the deep internal psychological passage to the unfoldment or discovery of what was not before, the new. Divine imagination has been recognized in the timeless depths of life and world existence as the principality of world formation. But we haven't heard anything about this in our sciences. The formation of external and internal projections and of the internal formation of higher order knowledge from our world perspective. Knowledge itself, therefore, which is a unity within our forming perceptions, brought forth upon the ever movement of field formation by the very same forming imagination who forms the wholeness of the world and every participating human being. Our marvelous scientists who hold to us, out to us to be the pace givers, the investigation of our world, always give us the high idea of their searching analytics and logic, rounded thinkers, say we, men and women of wisdom. But shouldn't we just ask a little question, perhaps? Shouldn't our science and psychology and our investigation of the operation and the processes of our world cross all borders and passions in its inquiry? Because through inquiry we advance our own knowledge and the knowledge of our world. Now Plutarch in 119 AD quotes Heraclitus and Euripides as follows. He says, "There could not be apart good things and bad, but there is a blend of both, so as to make things fair." We find this quote of Plutarch in the work of Grs Meade, a great scientist, a mystic, and a scholar, very fluent in Greek and Sanskrit languages. The purpose then of part A and part B of this video, a much bigger project than I anticipated, is to call to our memory from deep antiquity the interforming continuity of the world fantasy and world formation from the fountain of pre-Greek and pre-Abrahamic thought. Where did we in our past begin? How could such an ancient fountain of knowledge exist? And why haven't we heard about it? And on what grounds may we say that divine imagination is a very ancient idea and is the long-range wellspring, the fountain of our present ideas of the world? This brings us to the ancient work of the Poimandres, the shepherd of man, of Hermes Trismegistus. The Poimandres, the holy vision of Hermes. The divine Poimander is an ancient work, and it contains this vision of Hermes. The inner vision of the imagination of Hermes belongs to like a class of, or a genus of theology, which is known as vision, apocalypse, or revelation. Why is this relevant to this inquiry of ours, and in this particular 2 videos we are going to make? Renewal is an internal process, and internal relations of knowledge can be changed. A change in our world knowledge leads to changes in our world perspective and a change in our understanding. The Poimander is the very essence and is a timeless work of the greatest importance to man. A work that echoes its form through the depths of time and is the ancient mystical wellspring that illuminates through its excellence of vision our world still today, unfolding the formation of worlds of the subtle mind and pure matter, and of the manifest and the unmanifest. The Poimander is an inner vision unfolded of the imagination of the divine mind, the Logos. Now in 450, one of my favorite late Platonic philosophers, Proclus, says in his letter to Diodorus the Mechanist that there is a 4th state of awareness, or a 4th mode of knowledge that can't really be described as a method, because there's no logic, there's no demonstration, there's no analysis or anything that can help you with this. He says, this 4th state of awareness is more excellent than all the logical sciences of the Greeks. Now here I find an interesting quote by Grs Meade that says, the love of the mother of the gods for the soul represents the 4th state, the Turiya, state of Turiya in the Vedas, Vedantic mystic psychology, or the absorption of the masculine power of the soul by its own higher feminine nature. This is a very interesting statement that we'll explore a little more in these videos. The divine mind forms indeed a very ancient summit of the meaning of wondering or contemplation in ancient wisdom practices. The holy interconnections or bonds, such as the bond of love, are unbreakable, infinite and beyond eternity, and binds all living worlds together. One wholeness, a true world, a true through world, there is no separation here, of formation, reflection, of which this image on your screen is an analogy, a super vast continuity of imagination, projection, and interformation of resonant forms, consciousness, sensation, and formation, where participation within wholeness is of the nature of reflection. Hence, this reflective imitation some say copy, is the interconnected participation of us within wholeness of field formation, where nothing is truly separate and truly divided from the Father, Mother. For this internal participation is through the interconnections of moving, flowing, illuminating internal processes contained within wholeness. With this view on the lost psychology of our imagination and internal field resonance, which unexpectedly brought us to this work, we draw upon the translations of the excellent commentary of Grs Meade, the Gnostic philosopher, and the works of Thomas Taylor, whose thorough research on the subject is indispensable for a deeper understanding of the work on the fantasy or imagination. Simply stated, I don't know is the key to our unfolding imagination. It is the inner door that unfolds to us new understanding. The Paimander of Hermes Trismegistus possess a long-range, sacred, mystical tradition that can be traced to ancient Egypt and times before the Great Flood, described by Solon in Plato. Indications are that the Paimander, or man-shepherd, or shepherd of man, was composed from papyri and hieroglyphics around 3 to 400 AD in the Byzantine period. Now, Mead says, the scholar, he says, this tradition, this wisdom tradition of Hermes can be traced in 3 epochs of practice since pre-flood Egypt and Atlantis to the present time. It's perhaps best for us not to understand epoch as something that begins and ends, because we don't really know where the hidden circles, what role they play in the formation of the world. According to Mead, there appear to be these 3 epochs. The first is the first Hermes of Atlantis, Thoth, or the Agatu daemon. Agatu means good, the good spirit or mind, and represents the original sacred tradition of the mind and the spirit in the lands of the star Sirius, of Egypt and Atlantis before the Great Flood, and who were, as many say, lands of excellence. Solon writes in his Plato that 9,000 years before him there was a great flood. He was a well-respected administrator to kings, very knowledgeable man who made an impression on many kings. He even had a city named after him. So a man whose work is worthy of our attention. But think about the subtlety of unseen fields and vibration. When a man spends enough time with a particular work, and contemplation isn't something we do a little bit of today and a little bit of in 2 weeks' time. It is a continuous and unremitting paying of attention to the things that come to you that you should learn. So when one spends all this time in a subject or with a particular philosopher's work or a psychologist or whatever you do, you start to think. You produce, your words start to sound like that. What would you think would be happening here? In the second epoch, we see the second Thoth, Hermes, thrice greatest, a well-known term, the wisdom or mystery school of Hermes after the Great Flood, whose records and doctrines were preserved not only in hieroglyphic inscriptions, but also in manuscripts still written in the sacred character of pre-flood Atlantis and the Siriadic land. Siriadic land is the ancient description of Egypt and Atlantis before the flood and is connected with the star Sirius. Prior to the flood, we note the transference of this wellspring of knowledge to the people of Egypt after the flood has been responsible for the evolution of this wisdom practice up to our time. We have Isaac Newton, for instance, that translates into Latin into Latin a version of the Emerald Tablets of Hermes. I will put all the links for us into the description below. Also, you will find in that description of ours, you will find corrections, because sometimes there are corrections to be made of things that I say that's not quite correct, and so on. The third epoch is that of Tot, Tehut or Tehuti, Hermes, preserved by the priesthood of Manethu. Manethu was the high priest that served Ptolemy 1 and 2 in 285 BC. And some centuries prior to this time, who spoke a yet later form of Egyptian called Demotic, and that's from about 2600 BC. The layout of ancient Hermopolis or Camino and the region of Seas were the imitations of the heavens, as the Indians, similar to the Indians who had a heavenly Ganges, Akasha Ganga, and an earthly Ganges. So they had the heavens in ancient Egypt and Atlantis, a celestial Nile, and in Egypt a physical Nile, the life-giver of the land. This research of Mead supports the thorough research of Grs Hancock, who asserts that there was a transference of knowledge from Atlantis to Göbekli Tepe, where there are massive monolithic structures dating from 9000 BC. I will leave a link to his webpage in description. In addition, there appear to be a very lost and mystical interpretation of the Sphinx, whose feminine head, the claws of a lion, the body of a dog, the tail of a dragon, guards the entrance to the Great Pyramid. This is the mystery of the divine imagination, the sacred practice, and the symbol of the Sphinx. I was really amazed to see this in the work of Thomas Taylor. I'm going to put it in a link in the description below. Plutarch says of this very mystical interpretation, he says, Plutarch, for they do not call Hermes a dog as a proper name, but they associate the watching and waking from sleep of the animal, not knowing. Sorry, I got that wrong. They associate the watching and waking from sleep of the animal, who by knowing and not knowing, logos, determines friend from foe, with the most logos like of the gods. Proclus says of animal itself, or the all-perfect animal, the world soul, that animal itself is a whole of wholes, that is to say, a whole greater than wholes, and everywhere the one or the good was with being in the parts participating of it, and animal itself was only begotten. In Grs Meade, this is the only begotten Son of the great of God. We see the analogies going back in the depths of time. We observe that the great dog signifies Thoth as a symbol of the forming Logos, the divine mind. In Pausanias, the Greek historian in 1 AD says, by the Sphinx having the body of a dog, the discrimination power of the fantasy or imagination is implied. For a dog is the mythological image of the discriminating power, the Logos of the soul, the forming power of the soul. Logos here is formation. Hence Heraclitus, on his 12 conquests before the great flood, in Diodorus Siculus, who is an historian that lived in 100 BC, drew up his power, his discriminating Logos of his fantasy, from Hades, from, that is to say, from the obscurity of a sensible life. He says, but by her having the tail of a dragon and the claws of a lion, the communication of the fantasy with desire and anger is signified, and her wings are images of the elevating powers through love and truth and faith, which the fantasy naturally possesses, for imagination is re-elevated in conjunction with the returning soul to the region every way resplendent with divine light. But the fantasy, as Iamblichus beautifully observes, grows upon and fashions all the power of the soul. Mead says the term dog is a term used frequently among the Greeks, who presumably got the idea elsewhere, for servants, agents, or watcher of the higher gods. Thus the eagle is called a winged dog of Zeus. Dog, as we have seen, signifies the power of the world, soul, or great animal, also of individual souls. We continue our timeline, beginning with Ficinus in 443 AD. He is a major Platonic thinker and was commissioned by the Medici family to translate the Poemander, and his title is Mercurius Trismegistus on the power and wisdom of God. Further back in time, we have Heraclitus in 530 to 480 BCE. He produced a compilation of hymns ascribed to Orpheus, who apparently left no writing of his own. And Orpheus, according to Iamblichus, which we'll come to, was born prior to Homer in 800 BC and Hesiod in 750 BC. He, Orpheus, dedicates a hymn to Mercury in the Hymns of Orpheus. And here we see the hymns of, and I see the edge is cut off there. He says, Hermes, draw near, and to my prayer incline, angel of Jove and Maia's own son divine, studious contests, ruler of mankind, with heart almighty and prudent mind, and so on. The historians Diodorus Siculus, as we said, in 1 BC, and in Henry Oldfather, he translates Diodorus's work into English from Greek, and he says that the ancient contemplative tradition of Ulysses, the Eleusinian mystery, spans the great flood of 11 of Noah itself. For, says he, the Eleusinian mysteries, a practice of the inner passage of the imagination, was attended to in Atlantis by the god Hercules. Here Diodorus and Oldfather indicate that the mythological god Hercules attended the Eleusinian mysteries in preparation of his 12 conquests before the great flood. of Solon. And in addition, there is Zarathustra in Persia and Media, and there was already in Persia a well-established sacred mystical practice at the time with Prophet Zarathustra in 3000 BC, according to Pahlavi scholars. The further back one goes in time, the more difficult it is to put dates on things. But Zarathustra consecrates the caves and the nymphs of midmost earth, the mystical Eden of Media. Now I find it very interesting that Tolkien of Lord of the Rings sets his secondary world in Middle Earth. Persia is the birthplace of Zend Avesta, a most ancient holy scripture, and of the divine Mithras, who stand between light and dark forces, the tension between opposites, holding white pastures within his bosom. Then the next person we look at, referring to Hermes in time, this is all the history leading up to all the history of Hermes and the various people who writes about him. So he's Cosmogenes, Sans Cuneiathon. He's in his Cosmogenesis writes in roughly 1300s BC that Asclepius, the healer, is here at once identified with the cult of the great gods, Kabirim in Arabic, who were, according to the old Semitic tradition, the sons of Zedek. And he questions if this could be Melchizedek. He says, enough has been said to show us that both Sans Cuneiathon and the writer of the Shepherd, Hermes, drew their accounts of cosmogony, the heavens, from the same sources, namely the books of Thoth, or in other words, the Egyptian mystery tradition. The prototype of this cosmogenes is in the British Museum. I don't know if this link will get us there. This is Mead's Mead's summary of what I just said. Further back in time, we have Iamblichus in 250. Sorry, that's not correct. Iamblichus, I bring him in because he writes about Hermes and in the mysteries of the Egyptians. He lives in 250 to 325 AD. He says, according to him, the Egyptians held these principles of the formation of the world. The Egyptians don't say that all things are just material or physical. They establish a pure divine intellect above the world and one impartible intellect that is without division and separation in the world. They separate the life of the soul and the intellectual life from nature, not only in universe, but separates it also in man. And the Egyptians admit that intellect and reason, logos, subsist by themselves, that is within themselves. They say that generated essences were thus fabricated. They arrange the demiurgus as the primary father of things in generation, Genesis, and they acknowledge the existence of a vital power, a living illumination prior to the heavens and subsisting in the heavens. Here too, says Iamblichus, we find the ancient pagan methods explained. The pagans are the Neoplatonists. Look at those two holiday makers standing on one of the stones on the Great Pyramid, and look at the substance of the pyramid in relation to those two friends standing there, like well-known Egyptians. This deific teaching path of formation above that we've just Hermes indeed narrated, but say Iamblichus Beatus, the prophet of King Amon, the 9th king of the 26th dynasty, explained it, having found it in the Adata of Sais in Egypt, writ in hieroglyphics. These things above, says Iamblichus, the Egyptians do not investigate by mere reason alone, but through sacred theurgy, sacred practice. They announce that they are able to ascend to the understanding of more elevated universal essences. That is to say, through their imagination and contemplation, they were able to reach within to the good and to the internal psychological formation or of thought or imagination. Here we have a link to Iamblichus, I think. Let's see if the link works. It's taking us to the archives, and here is, if we click on this, make it a little bigger, and we'll get some indication. Come now. Oh, it doesn't like to be magnified, he says. Proclus says, Iamblichus says in chapter 4, he says, for the books which are circulated under the name of Hermes contain Hermaic opinions, though they frequently employ the language of the philosophers, and so on and so forth. And there are those darlings visiting Egypt, and of course, isn't it beautiful? Mead introduced us to Manetho, the beloved of Thoth. We've seen his name in the third epoch of Thoth. And we'll briefly look at what he says. He has written a book called Sutis, which the book itself is lost, but there is a mention of this book and a quote of the introduction to this book by the monks in Siculus, and it's proposed then to make, he says in this passage, he says it's of Manetho's book, he says it's proposed to make a few extracts concerning the Egyptian dynasties from the books of Manetho. This Manetho, being the high priest of the heathen temples in Egypt, based his replies to King Ptolemy on the monuments which lay in the Syriatic country. These monuments, the stelae, Manetho tells us, were engraved in the sacred language and in the characters of the sacred writing by Thoth, the first Hermes before the flood, and after the flood they were translated from the sacred language into the then common tongue, but still written in hieroglyphic characters, stored away in books, in inverted commas, by the good daemon, the good mind, the first Hermes, son, and the second Hermes, father of Tut, in the inner chambers of the temples of Egypt. This Hermes, referred to above, says Mead, was the second epoch, the father of Tut. We are told elsewhere by Manetho, and who who is the son of the good spirit, Tut, who is the son of the good spirit, the Agato daemon, who was the first Hermes. He notes, the Syriac documents known in antiquity as the Stelae of Hermes, or the Stelae of Seth, and are erroneously spoken of in Latin and English as columns or the pillars of Hermes. He also notes that the term Syriac and Seth is connected in this theology of Egypt prior to the Great Flood with the star Sirius. The astrological significance, in my view, connects with Graham Hancock's views of Giza pertaining to the ancient journey of the soul, with reference to the orientation of the openings of the pyramid to the heavens. Of the importance of Manetho's statement in his sutras, Mead says, here we have a verbal quotation from a document purporting to be written prior to 250 BC. These books are ascribed to Hermes, thrice graced, and this is the first time that this title is used in existing Greek literature. Of course, there is much more in this marvelous body of work of Mead, the scholar and mystic, who, for those who look for more substantiation of Hermes and his three epochs. The same Manetho, says Mead, tells us another story when he writes of a certain king of the third dynasty in BC 3700. That is about more than 1,000 years before Abraham. Tosorthris reigned 29 years is his name. He is called Asclepius by the Egyptians for his medical knowledge. He built a house hewn of stones and greatly patronized literature. Sosaurus is Tesher or Tesher-Sa-Dusher, the second king of the third dynasty from Memphis. The house of hewn stones which he built received their confirmation by excavations made in 1819, and there is the stepper pyramid of Imhotep, Asclepius Imhotep, built in around 3700 BC. Who is Thoth, then? Thoth was considered to be the heart and tongue of Ra, the Supreme. That is, not only the reason and mental powers of the god Ra and the means whereby they were translated into speech, but rather the controller of the life and instrument of the utterance, or the logos, the words of the supreme will. He was the logos in the fullest sense of that mysterious name, the creative word. He it is who utters the words whereby the will of the Supreme is carried into effect, and his utterance, his speech, word, sound, is that of necessity and law. His words are not the words of feeble human speech, but a compelling orders of the creative will of God. Thoth, however, says Mead, is the personification, the thought-out manifestation of the mind of God, as well as the all-pervading and governing and the directing power of heaven and earth. Forms a feature of the Egyptian religion which is as sublime as the belief in the resurrection of the dead in a spiritual body, and as a doctrine of everlasting life. Thoth is then the Logos of God, who in his relation to mankind becomes the supreme master of wisdom, the mind of all masterhood and formation. With all of the preceding information and with reference to what is to come, it might be a good idea to note some important perspectives on the interpretation of ancient myths. Very important perspectives. Thomas Taylor observes in his works on Plato, particularly in his Republic, in his introduction to Book 2 of the Republic, the fables of Hesiod and Homer are not adapted to the education of youth. In other words, those that are not well studied will be apt to misinterpret the fables. These fables follow, says he, the nature of wholes and the order of things, and conjoin with true beings such as those who are capable of being led to the elevated study of divine concerns. Taylor indicates on the mythological battles of the gods and giants, the Titans, that they signify forces in opposition, and that the war of opposite relating to Minerva indicate an internal logos, an inner battle for unification of knowledge, who possesses in its resolution, in other words, the tension between opposites. The resolution of the tension is always a higher unity. It is so knowledge is the bridge, the inner bridge to unification of the human soul and the human world with the divine, the forward motion of the soul to higher unity. Some words of caution on the interpretation of ancient myths. In Plutarch, we see the true inquirer must of his own initiative forever keep searching and probing more deeply into the intimate reason of things. Of all attempted interpretations of the Egyptians, he finds, Plutarch, the least satisfactory to be that of those who are content to limit hermeneutics, that is to say, interpretation, of the mystery myths simply to the operations of ploughing and sowing and maybe add gathering and fertilization. With this vegetation god theory, he has little patience, and says Mead, and he stigmatizes its professors as that dull crowd. But here is the thing that Mead observes, and here perhaps some of us may think that Plutarch is not out of date even in the 20th century. His arguments might be recommended to the consideration of those anthropologists who are just now with such complacently running to death what Mr. Andrew Lang humorously calls the Covent Garden theory. This reminds me of Richard Feynman's famous statement of armchair philosophers. Andrew Lang have made an appearance in our other video on the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit of Tolkien. They refer to the easy Darwinian evolution. Speaking of Tolkien, he in his fairy stories has three views on the interpretation of myth and religion, which he says should be separate. He says, with reference to the study of primitive people, which is what Carl Jung did too, he says, the hasty survey, the not so well studied reading, finds only their wilder tales. A closer examination finds their cosmological myths. Only patience and inner knowledge discovers their philosophy and religion, the truly worshipful, of which the gods are not necessarily an embodiment at all, or only in a variable measure embodied. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. There is much more history in this marvelous body of work of the prehistory of the Greeks in Grs Meade. Our next video series, part 4b, is going to highlight the main points of our investigation into the lost psychology of our imagination of projection and world formation in ancient Egypt.